Christopher Edley Jr. is the president and co-founder of the Opportunity Institute. He was dean of UC Berkeley Law School and continues there as the Honorable William H. Orrick Jr., Distinguished Professor of Law, teaching administrative law and education law. Before Berkeley, he was a professor at the Harvard Law School for 23 years, where he co-founded the Harvard Civil Rights Project. And he's served in a number of capacities in Washington, D.C., in policy and budget positions, and in 5 presidential campaigns. Professor Edley was a co-author of the Getting Down to Facts 2 summary report and the author of the Equity Review, so he's deeply familiar with this content. And he's a faculty director of PACE. So please join me in welcoming Chris up to the stage.
Thank you very much, Heather. And thanks to all of you for staying, and most of you look awake. And those of you who aren't, you know who you are. Well, it is a privilege and a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk with you all about getting down to facts, and specifically about the equity issues, with an emphasis on where we go from here. The context for my remarks includes the fact that those of us who've been working in this business for decades share a profound frustration with the difficulty of moving the needle on equity issues. That is to say, narrowing disparities, group disparities, with respect certainly to outcomes, but also with respect to opportunities. So the great question is, if it's been so hard to move the needle, and if these disparities seem so large and persistent, what are we missing? What else can be done? A particular within that context that frightens me as I look at the California data are the disparities with respect to Latino students. Not only is California moving in a direction the opposite of where the nation as a whole is moving in terms of Latino/Anglo comparisons, but, of course, the proportion of Latinos in our California student population is growing. So in that respect, the tragedy and the danger of this specific set of disparities really looms large in my mind, and I hope will loom large in the minds of policy voices from here on out. And the last point of context to keep in mind is that both the federal government and the state government have moved away from what had been, I think, some momentum behind the idea of attaching consequences to accountability, and devolution to districts is a key element of that. Now, I said in one of the breakout sessions a little bit earlier that if you accept the cliche that education is a civil right, and you consider that progress on civil rights has rarely, if ever, been driven by local policymakers, then you have to wonder whether equity, thought of as a civil right, will be advanced in a forceful way to the extent that responsibility for it devolves to local government. The LCFF and LCAP reforms are, in a sense, based on a lot of hypotheses. At least from an equity perspective, the question is, will the change in the distribution of resources have a substantial impact, especially on closing disparities in outcomes? And there, as you've probably heard during the course of the day, there is some suggestive evidence, and we can hope that that pattern of evidence builds going forward. But there's also the challenge of the LCAP process, which in a sense reflects a hypothesis that by engaging the public and giving communities a voice in important decisions at the local level, we can transform the politics of education opportunity and excellence. I'd say the initial evidence on that is disappointing, and there are difficulties with building capacity. There are difficulties with elevating the ambition of public engagement, and there is cynicism on both sides of the table. That is to say, among outsiders as well as among insiders, with many, if not most districts, approaching the LCAP process as a check-the-box exercise, just like parent night at the high school when everybody goes to the high school gym at 6 p.m. on Thursday to talk about what should happen in the school. So that's context. I'm not going to review all of the equity-related findings, of course. We have a brief to do that, as well as the individual technical papers. And I know that Susanna and others have spoken about that during the day. But I just want to pick three that, for me, are particularly salient. The first is underfunding. And as I said, there's suggestive evidence with respect to the benefits of LCFF, but that is in a context of dramatic underfunding of education within California as a whole. The corrected data in the AIR report suggests a 38% shortfall between what California spends in education and what it would take, according to expert panels, in order to actually deliver on promises made in state policy. 38%. So when we talk about addressing these problems of resource adequacy, it's going to take a revolution in the way in which we think about revenues and spending in California. And it's going to take sustained commitment to the redistributional values that are implicit, actually they're explicit, in the LCFF formula. Second, I'd also note here that an aspect of the resource problem is the pension liabilities. And as a takeaway from this report, the most surprising to me is not just the seriousness of the unfunded pension liability problem facing probably every district. I don't know, Mike, you would know, but I imagine it's every school district in the state. And dealing with those unfunded pension liabilities out of the operating budgets of schools will put extraordinary pressure on classroom spending that is absolutely essential if we're to have any hope of improving the equity we observe in student outcomes. So let me just extend it and say that pension liabilities are a civil rights issue. And the way we approach it and the way we engineer solutions to that will have a direct bearing on our ability to respond to equity issues in the classroom and schools. And the last point, which I want to elaborate on, is about teachers. I think we've heard a lot today in various panels about the challenges regarding teachers, so let me not belabor that. Okay, let me move from my 3 major takeaways to 6 prescriptions. And here I want to emphasize that this is getting beyond getting down to facts, to try to do some preliminary sketching of where I think policy needs to go in the coming years, policy and the actions that we all take individually. The first is moving the needle on equity, so to speak, requires that we think about what are the correct measures and indicators of equity on both sides, the input side and the outcome side. And a substantial agreement about what those are and building a database that will illuminate those, I think, is a fundamental requirement to build any kind of political or regulatory accountability for equity. The dashboard and the state's ESSA plan are a start, but they're not good enough to support a more nuanced and intensive examination of the equity questions. The second is that while we are quite correctly ever eager to point out the challenges created by poverty, the conference dedicated to eliminating poverty is in some other hotel somewhere. And while we're waiting for them to figure that out, our question is, what can be done to mitigate the effects of poverty on learning, on student outcomes? Now, a common prescription is community schools and the integration of a set of services and supports that is the goal in community school models, and also the driving force behind many charter school strategies. But we're far short of where we need to be to recognize the implications of recent science. So the recent science in the neurosciences and in human development, for the first time in the last few years, has reached a strong consensus on the biological, the neurochemical consequences of chronic stress, adversity, and trauma. So it's not just that kids who have been through that are gonna have a hard time. It's that researchers have now identified the specific changes in brain function and even brain structure that result from chronic stress, from poaching the brain in cortisol, if you will. So while the social determinants of health have been a common concern of medicine for a generation, we're now understanding better the way in which context, interacting with personal characteristics, has an influence on the brain itself and on learning, not just on health. What that means is that the equity challenge is to see to it that the kinds of interventions and supports the kinds of services and resources that science tells us can mitigate, can ameliorate the difficulties for learning created by chronic stress and adversity? Are those resources available to the students who need them? And, to put it more generally, are we doing a good job of fitting those opportunities, those resources, to the need? But another implication of the science is that because of the diversity in contexts, both community and family contexts that our students face, because of the diversity in their personal characteristics like resilience, because of the multiple developmental pathways that are a fact of human biology, all of that suggests that the response to chronic stress, as well as the response to academic obstacles that arise from adversity, the response has to be individualized in some respects, in important respects. And I want to add that among the adversities faced by many children are the social meaning of race and the consequences of linguistic isolation. The consequences of immigration status. All of that in addition to the adversity that arises from poverty and the incidence of poverty. So that whole child framework for understanding equity and the need to develop indicators both of student need and of the adequacy of the opportunities that are provided and the extent to which they fit student need, all of that is critical if we're going to move the needle. A third prescription goes to teachers, and here I want to get even a little bit more radical. If part of the answer is a whole child framework that is responsive to individuality, then a new teaching profession in which teachers are developed and prepared to work in a redesigned school that allows opportunities for individualization, that's a different kind of profession. It's one in which there is broader professional autonomy, in which we expect well-trained teachers to exercise judgment in the pedagogical and other activity related to these individual children. It is, if you will, like being a nurse practitioner or a physician's assistant, as opposed to the conventional profession of nursing. Along with that professional autonomy and judgment comes additional accountability, additional compensation, additional prestige. Now, moving into that world will also help, I believe, with the teacher supply problem. And that bargain, professional autonomy for compensation and prestige, is a grand bargain that I think will be required to win this battle. Infrastructure for evidence-based policy choices, and by this I mean, notwithstanding statutory and regulatory language, federal and state, about evidence-based decision-making or research-informed decision-making, the reality is that we do not have an infrastructure that helps decision makers down to the level of principals knowledgeable about what the evidence actually is, about what the good and bad examples are from Miami-Dade, from Kentucky, from Massachusetts, or even from other districts within California. And without some kind of a peer review process for the local decision making that is now all the rage, we cannot expect there to be evidence-based decision making. Instead, many decisions will be based on intuition and politics and inertia. So intentionality about understanding the ways in which we can provide the needed intellectual capital at the moment and in the form in which it can make a difference, that is an important project for us all going forward. I would say multiplying the budget of the CCEE by about 13.2 would be an important and valuable step in that direction. Getting down to facts 3, my prediction is that will happen in 10 years. Remember that Johnny Carson, never mind. But what I'm interested in, Karnak, what I'm interested in is immediately is getting down to facts 2.3, by which I mean 3 years from now, I would like to see a package of studies like these, but focused particularly on equity issues, because those challenges are so daunting, so severe, so crucial to the state, because things are moving so quickly, we can't wait 10 years to take another comprehensive look. So all of you who are funders, getting down to facts 2.3 focused on equity. Lastly, religion. So some of you have heard me describe a triangle for decision making with 3 vertices. One is science, evidence. Another is intuition. And the third is politics. Well, it's clear that evidence can play a role in intuition. Sometimes it can play a role in politics. I mean, LCFF is an example of that. But something that really shapes politics are our values. Our values, including our sense of who should I care about? What differences are important to me? I'm a heathen, personally. I mean, the closest I've come to God is majoring in math in college. But for most Americans, and maybe most Californians, values discourse and values instruction comes through their spirituality and their religion. Yet the fact is that equity movements, since Martin Luther King was assassinated, have focused on policy plumbing and footnotes. That's you researchers out there. Not on values. Since most Americans think about values in the context of their spiritual lives, I propose that we find a way to make new allies with the faith community, not because fixing these problems will take an act of God. While that may be true, it's because perhaps they have insights about how to mobilize spirituality and religious beliefs in the service of education equity. It worked in the 60s for a lot of the public. I believe that it can work in the decade ahead for Californians concerned with education equity. So to conclude, I want to say something that I have often said in the context of racial justice. This is not rocket science, this education equity stuff. it is harder than rocket science, right? Rocket science is, let's put a man on the moon, 10 years, done. That's not education equity, not by a long shot. We have to recognize the difficulty of it as we seek to accumulate intellectual capital and as we aspire to make these tasks doable. And my concluding point is that everybody in here, you're here because you care about facts or because you wandered into the wrong room. If you care about facts, then I want to implore you to be an advocate. I want to implore you to be an advocate for the evidence. For the evidence. Not for any particular political or ideological view, but for the evidence. There's not enough of that in our culture today. But if we can't join that mission, we will not get to the moon. Thank you all very much.